This is the Convene Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Convene Talk. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor. Jen, as the author of the December 2023 cover story on the Olympics in Paris, could you share a bit more about the story and developments you've seen since the beginning of the year? And what's your take on things?
Sure. So it's interesting thinking back to this story because I wrote it in September, October of last year, and now we're only 10 days away from the Olympics, which is really exciting. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like there's been a lot more chatter about the Olympics this year for a number of reasons, both good and bad. And I think for me, and what this story really kind of dives into is that this Olympics is attempting to be the most sustainable in Olympic history, which I think is really interesting. So I got to chat with two members of the International Olympics Committee for my story who shared a lot of insight into how they're doing that. So it's not necessarily a new goal for them. It's actually something that they've been working on for years. And I think Paris marks a really big point in that journey as they've made this the Olympics where they are trying to cut their carbon emissions in half. So that'll be the first time that they achieve that. And they're doing that in a few different ways. They're doing that one just kind of naturally. It's born out of the destination that they chose, Paris. For example, they're relying on Paris's public transportation infrastructure to reduce emissions around transportation, for instance. Also getting really creative about the venues they use. So part of what makes the Olympic footprint in the past so big is that building new infrastructure for event venues has been quite carbon intensive. So this, for the 2024 Summer Olympics, 95% of the infrastructure will be existing or temporary, and those buildings will be built in a very sustainable way, which I kind of dive into the specifics of in the story. But I think it's kind of broader than just carbon emissions. It seems like the Olympics is just becoming generally more mindful. This is actually the first time, the 2024 Summer Olympics is the first time that the Olympics will achieve gender parity, meaning there will be as many women competing as men in the games, which is really cool. So there's quite a lot going on, and there's quite a lot being attempted to be achieved. So we'll see if it actually happens with this year. So one of the interesting things that I really honed in on in this story is how the Olympics is using Paris and really France generally, because a lot of the games are being held outside of the city in different parts of France instead of building a building. So for example, the Seine is playing a really big role. The Seine is going to be where they host the opening ceremony. It's going to be a nearly 4-mile long procession. They're setting up stands for spectators along the Seine. And the Seine will also be the site where they host some of the swimming games. So I think that's gotten a lot of media attention in the past few weeks or few months, simply just because it's an amazing feat. They've been working on cleaning up the Seine to make it swimmable and safe. We checked it earlier today, and it sounds like they're not quite sure if that's going to happen. And it's a bit of a risky move because there's really, as I understand it, no plan B. Barbara, our deputy editor, actually wrote a great sidebar on the Seine specifically and what they've done to clean it up and get it ready. So, Barbara, I'd love to know a little bit more. Maybe you could share just a little bit about what you learned in writing this piece.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. What I learned, I learned the history of the river and how long it had been unswimmable, and the many, many, many attempts through history, like going back like 30 years, that we're cleaning the river up. And so for that reason, it's just like an amazing experiment to do that. And as you said, high risk, just very high risk. And I think with all of these big projects that they're doing, they're really doing new things, and they're doing that with the aid of science. They're the latest ways. It's new technologies, new thinking about how to do it on these problems that have been with us for so long, that even if it fails, like I don't know where they'll swim, even if it fails, there's so much that we've learned about what that means to people to have the river, how important the river is. There'll be things that come out of like the experiments. Like all of that is very painful going through it, and like you really expose yourself to failure. But even in failure, you'll learn something. One of the things that I've been watching when you talked about the Olympic Village or the buildings they're building, which includes the Olympic Village, is that they're under some, it's a controversy there because they've been built without air conditioning. And, Paris has been subject, as many, many, many cities have around the world, to heat waves that, really challenge regular bodies. But people who've been training all their lives for this moment in the Olympics, it's, such a gamble to not have AC. And the reason they did it, of course, was to cut emissions. And now the US is planning to take portable air conditioners, but so are many other countries just because it's such a gamble on their performances. And so that's just one of the areas where like these competing priorities come into play. I mean, I feel like it's hard to know a solution for that. Like they didn't just decide we'll just take out the air conditioning. Like I was reading about how they designed the buildings, and they really, they really use kind of sometimes old techniques, but also new ways of using old techniques. So they'd be cool, but it's not like you could test it. I thought, well, why didn't they test it? And I went, well, the last time it would be as hot as it is in July and August in Paris was last July and August. So there's all these questions. Oh, and I don't think I finished my thought about like if people bring all these air conditioners, what are the emissions of shipping air conditioners? I don't think there's enough portable air conditioners in Paris, so people will be all this freight coming in. So it's just kind of it's like it's really messy. And I think what it really to me makes stand out in just such high relief is that these are human problems. These are problems that we have to settle by being able to talk to each other, we talked about protests. I mean, one of the things about the river is that all these people are threatening to defecate I could just say poop in the river to protest.
It's a poop protest.
It's a poop protest. And I cannot, okay, so if you're thinking about sustainability, there is not no person who's genuinely concerned about environmental sustainability is going to think it's a good idea to poop in a river. So they're using this, to leverage other gripes and grievances. And so I just think it's going to be amazing to see what happens, but it's very clear that we need new ways of listening to each other, new ways of like not just jumping to these conclusions of like that was a terrible idea. So anyway, Michelle, what are you thinking about all of this?
I'm thinking not specific to the Olympics, but just the way my brain works. I was making connections to what you said about you have to applaud. And Jen, what you said, just the risks that the Olympics are taking this year, to me, shows like a different kind of culture, right? And so this is something that I just wrote about this morning for my column, because I read an IDEO article about Moderna recently. Moderna, as you all remember, was a savior for all of us to just like in remarkable time brought a COVID-19 vaccine to market. and just smashed all records with their land speed run there. That's my only connection to the Olympics, is their that they smashed a record. But the article talked about Moderna's culture, and their culture was one where they embraced risk, and they embraced uncertainty, and they embraced, just looking here to make sure I'm quoting correctly, embraced speed, obviously. So that is what enabled the feat. And so an example of that, which I loved, that IDEO provided, was when a critical piece of equipment arrived at their offices for the vaccine, it was too big to fit through the door. So they realized that they were going to lose days by trying to disassemble the equipment. So what they did is the employees took a sledgehammer to the wall and opened the wall to get that piece of equipment in. And I thought, here, this is an organization with a sense of urgency. But they had a problem because as they had explosive growth, they had to also bring in new talent and acquire other employees, other people from other companies. And these companies, which sounded very familiar to me, were from outside the biotech industry, from organizations with establishment cultures that are sometimes slow, bureaucratic, territorial, and cautious. And that sounded very familiar to me when I was looking at our Sacred Cows responses for our cover story. Is a lot of the stuff people brought up we've heard before, and it makes you wonder, like, why are we so slow to evolve as an industry? And yet you look at the Olympics, and they're doing remarkable things. Whether or not they succeed, they're taking risks. And I'll finish up quickly here. What they ended up doing at Moderna was coming up with mindsets that they shared with everyone, including the new hires. It's part of their onboarding. And I love what they are. Urgency is an investment. Risk creates opportunity. Pivots are progress. Your job is more than your job description. And you don't have to grow to grow. And then finally, push past the possible. So I think we could all learn from those things. And it seems like there's been a cultural shift in the Olympics, and whether or not we'll see how it all works out, but you have to applaud them for taking those risks. Casey, what do you think?
I completely agree, Michelle. I was just thinking back to past Olympic Games and how there's always controversies in the weeks leading up to it. There's always news stories about crazy things that are happening in the destination. But I find it impressive that the majority of controversies surrounding the Paris Olympics actually have to do with their sustainability efforts. Just like the air conditioner problem that Barbara brought up, it has to do with, the ways that they're trying to be innovative, and it might not work out, but at least they're trying to do something different. I just remember in the past hearing so much about all these new buildings that are created in these global destinations that ultimately go to waste and are just abandoned after the games. And what a horrible thing that is for the environment, and what a waste for the destination too, to have their space taken up in that way. So I find it impressive that most of the news pieces we're seeing are really about whether or not their sustainability efforts will work out, because at least they're aiming for something positive. Curt, what do you think?
I also agree. I just want to rattle off a few of the things that I think it's just amazing how they're approaching that, and the things that they're doing, that I'm like, oh, wow, I never thought of that would be a possibility. There's a company called Equinox, digital infrastructure company, that's supplying the excess heat from a data center to warm up Paris's 2.5 million liter Olympic swimming pool, which is for some of the swimming, not obviously the stuff that's going to go on in the dirty river. And then some of the stadiums are powered by 100% renewable energy, including their own solar panels. Like the big building, I think Jen rewrote about this building, the one that looks like the saddle. I can't remember what it's called, but it has 6,000 seats that are all made from plastic, from recycled plastic, which apparently all the seats at all the Olympic venues that are new are made from recycled plastic, which I thought was really cool. The way they were going to heat the Olympic Village was geothermally with water from an underground pool, and it was supposedly going to lower the temperature in all the rooms by 6 degrees Celsius. But turns out they've now ordered 2,500 air conditioners to make sure that the athletes stay cool. But who knows? Maybe they'll find a way to do something with that. And then all the other new stuff was built with really sustainable supplies, which Jen also wrote about. But I just think that just the idea that they're going to all this trouble to try this is pretty, worth applauding and will probably work. I mean, most of it will probably work, right? There might be some drawbacks, and who knows, maybe this will be a way that other places say, we don't have to tear down old buildings to do this thing, and we can find a way to reuse current buildings, because they're reusing some buildings that were totally in disrepair. This one story I read in The Guardian talks about a couple buildings from the 1900 Olympics that were there, and how they've just completely redone them, which I think is amazing. So yeah, it sounds really cool to be able to go afterward and see how these are used afterward, because I wouldn't want to be anywhere near there during the Olympics, I don't think.
I actually wanted to make a connection to what you just said, that you wouldn't like to be anywhere near Paris during the Olympics. And some of the stories that were published, people, actually Parisians, that are pleading to tourists not to go to Paris during the Olympics, and highlighting things such as how expensive it will be, that they're purposefully raising prices on public transportation and other things that will not make sense, and how they're actually asking students to not live in their dorms during the Olympics so they can rent them out for a lot of money to tourists. So there, of course, like I think Casey said, there's always controversy before such major events. So it's not a surprise that such things are coming out. And for sure, it will be a struggle for local people, because Paris is a very old city. It has old infrastructure, sidewalks are tiny, and somebody highlighted that if there are 16 million people in the city, it will be possible to walk, drive, move. It's currently very hard, imagine with so many people. So there's always the ups and downs. What actually impressed me was a story on the pop-up restaurants that they're planning. And there's a company that the IOC contracted to create all these impressive 80 restaurants that would just pop up for the duration of the Olympics, and then they'll dismantle that. And I'll link the story in the show notes. That's from the New York Times. So they highlight the good parts and also the questionable parts of this idea, because they have to actually build them up, find a way to bring electricity and water and all these things into random spots in the city that are not created for these build-ups. And then they have to be dismantled, but these places are currently busy, so they haven't even started to work on some of these pop-up restaurants. And then there was also the question, so why would you go and have food in this pop-up and not go into a similar restaurant that's owned by a Parisian, right? So would they compete with the locals? And in the interview, they said, well, actually, we'll try to complement their offering. I'm not sure. There wasn't more on how that's going to happen. So it will be interesting. And they are saying that for these 80 pop-up restaurants, they actually have to meet all the strict sustainability standards that the IOC has placed. So I'm like, kudos to that. They have to source local food, and most of the food has to be vegetarian. It has to offer mostly vegetarian options. So it will be definitely interesting to see what's going to happen. Barbara, what's on your mind?
I was thinking when we're talking about protests, I was thinking back to the story that Michelle wrote last summer about risks at events, which I thought was an excellent story. And the part that really just that I loved was when she talked about protests at AGU, at the American Geophysical Union events, and the talk about thinking differently, how to kind of incorporate that into your meaning, how to make a place for that. And I was reading about the history of protests at Olympic events, and all the things that people have tried, like making the place where people can protest so far out and having so much security that they kind of became holding pens, instead of like actual authentic places where people could speak. And this is a crazy idea, but what if the procession is such a big part of the Olympics? Like what if they had a procession somewhere? Like what if instead of like trying to tamp it down, which it's going to pop up, what if they did that jujitsu move and said, bring it, let's figure out how we can listen to you. And I wonder if there would be, more, if people might respond to that in an authentic way and say, here's what I'm trying to say. Because it's such an incredibly huge global platform that I think people think I have to use this. I have something so important to say that even if it hurts people in this way, I've got to use it because it's so important. And what if, I'm just thinking, I would love to see just ideas for how we can listen to what people are saying when they're protesting without, without it harming events and without it pushing back so hard that there's then this equal and greater force against again. So it's that the protest is a really big part, I think, has become a big part of the Olympic story.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of the recent news around Copa America, another major event, and the final that really became something else. And I think it brings a lot of questions also towards event planners. So how can we make these events safer? There's always going to be some kind of a controversy there, right? Even if it's a sporting event, and the sporting events in this case are trying to promote solidarity and togetherness, but still it's a competition. So yeah, how can I make them better experiences in general, especially in this new age, and safe, first and foremost?
I saw that they were dismantling the the vents to get literally to climb through the ventilation system to get inside. I can't imagine what you do to prevent that kind of rabid fandom. I think sporting events on that level, especially like soccer/football, like in other countries, I think it's such a more intense culture. Like I feel like I don't really I'm in the South where college football is a big deal, but still it's nothing compared to like when I lived in Buenos Aires and soccer was going on, or, in Germany and France, I feel like it's just a totally different level of fandom. So I watching or kind of reading about the Copa event, and I'm not sure that the Olympics will see that same amount of fandom, but hopefully not climbing through ventilation systems to get inside. But yeah, that's definitely an issue. Wow.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? With the Olympics bringing the opening outside, making it more accessible for the first time, to a large amount of people. I think that's very
that was
cool.
intentional. They were like, that's one of the facet. They told me, it's not just about environmental sustainability. They were like, the way they kind of looked at it was, we want to make this a more accessible, welcoming event to everyone. Whereas previously, if you could spend the money on flights, tickets, etc., then you could come and participate and be a spectator. But that's not necessarily, possible for everyone. So they're like, if we could open up at least the opening ceremonies to as many, especially locals, as possible who are, being affected, this might help. But it does seem like the number of people, I think they told me when I interviewed them, they were expecting a few 100,000 would be able to come and sit in like the designated spectator section. And now it seems like that number has dwindled quite a bit for reasons I'm unsure of. But I admire the intention behind that.
Yeah, exactly. And not having all these white elephants, right? All these just venues that would remain for no purpose. I think they're trying to reuse them also in destinations that hosted the Olympics many years ago, like Athens. I'm just trying to repurpose them right now, even if it's years later, but find them. Find use
Yeah,
it.
that's been like the biggest. It seems like that's been one of the biggest criticisms is just like and not just of the Olympics, of like other global events like the World's Fair and others, just like the wastefulness of the venues not being used. But I know that, for example, the Aquatic Center and the village that's kind of being built up around it, they have some really intentional plans, because it was specifically built in a community that is, I'm told, is under-resourced. They don't have a lot of like public infrastructure. So what's going to remain will be affordable housing for that community. The Aquatic Center, I believe, is meant to stay and be accessible to the kids in that community. And I didn't know this until I wrote the story, but that particular community just outside of Paris proper has some of the lowest rates of children who don't know how to swim. So it's meant to help these kids, here's a place where you can come learn how to swim. So I thought that was really awesome. But yeah,
they had that in the story today about the Aquatic Center, and that they'll take out half those plastic bottle seats, and they're going to put in paddleball courts, and they're going to make it like a sports place for kids and the neighborhood and the community and stuff.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
So that sounds like the biggest success, maybe, if it all goes through, because I've read a bunch about how they had planned to extend all the train lines, and apparently only one has gotten extended. And so there's the list just sort of goes, it worked, didn't work, we didn't get there, that kind of thing. And that's a good one. But I also read that the Olympic Village, those housing units are going to be will not be affordable to any regular folks. Yeah, I just read that in that same story.
That's like the opposite of what I was told.
I know. I mean, that's what they had planned to do, of course, but it doesn't always, I guess, happen.
I'll have to dig into that. Okay. That's disappointing if that's true.
That to me is like another shift, like a cultural shift, is thinking differently about building. I mean, I feel like it could come out of just this, the big shifts post-pandemic. Like so many cities now are left with these office buildings that people aren't working in, and meanwhile the crisis in housing. So I feel like that's another way that culture is shifting. Like, is it always a great thing to hire a star architect and leave some building that then becomes, as Maggie said, a white elephant that isn't used? We know that we need more housing. Like, that's something that people are always going to need, is housing.
Yeah, I think that's at the root of what we chatted about last week with Barcelona and over tourism and Paris too. Just the number of affordable housing that is turned into short-term rentals instead of affordable housing. And I see it here in Charleston too. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them. In Berlin?
Yeah. In fact, they've set some laws into place that some people who have exclusive like furnished apartments for short terms can't rent to the same person more than once. So like you can't extend your lease because they want to make more housing here, but and I guess maybe they think that's a way to, but I think that plays into the landlord's hands because they can just rent to somebody else and charge more. But that's a huge problem here too, is housing, affordable housing versus short-term rentals and furnished stuff. And
Yeah,
also,
like,
nobody here wants to have them. No citizens want things torn down, but all the developers want to tear everything down and build new. So that's always a big clash too.
Yeah. That's what we're
yeah,
seeing in Charleston.
just want to make a note here to those listening that is actually next week's episode in terms of how the episodes will appear. We're referring something in the future, right? It's like a sneak peek into next week.
Sorry, listeners. We don't know what we're doing.
And I think I just want to close it on a good note. So another good thing from the Olympics that will come out will be the standards, right? That they're working on in terms of sustainability.
Yeah,
so that
they're already out.
Yeah, and that's something tangible for event planners that can just pick up and adapt to their events. And yeah, you referred to some already in the story that was published, and maybe there will be some other takeaways or case studies based on the Olympics afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
I
And that'd be
hope
great
so. That's the
competition,
case. Great.
right?
Breakdancing.
It is the
New
Olympics. after all.
breakdancing competition.
And the surfing is taking place in Tahiti.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, which I think that's an experiment.
I'm really interested to see how the coverage of the games incorporates all of these innovations that they're making. I'm sure they'll spend some time highlighting all of the ways they're becoming more sustainable and in what ways. So that'll be
Yeah.
interesting to watch.
And if the Olympics are to promote, kind of this feeling that we're all in this together, like I think this does, for me at least, it takes a lot of the, it takes some of the spotlight off which country wins the most gold medals toward like this, this really intense challenge that we're all facing together about climate change.
Yeah, and they're gonna do it in extreme conditions, right? Because it's the hottest summer to date.
Right.
And they're preparing. There was another article on how athletes are preparing for the extreme heat that they're not used to training in, competing in. So
maybe everyone will be in the river to cool down.
I think I'm most excited for Snoop Dogg being a commentator on the equestrian competitions, which is going to be held at Versailles. And I literally can't think of a better matchup than Snoop Dogg at Versailles. Talking about equestrian
dressage.
Curt,
is it really happening?
Yes.
It's so funny.
That's cool.
Curt, your comment about cooling off in the river was actually part of their plan. Like that was one of the reasons that they talked about, which is why they wanted to clean up the river, because that had historically been a way that people cooled off. And then it was illegal to swim for decades because it was unsafe. So all true.
Hopefully not during the swim competitions. With the swimmers. So the opening in terms of airing this episode will be just hours away. We'll be watching, like seeing what's going to happen. Is it going to be in the sand? Is it going to be somewhere else? Where else? Interesting question. So for everybody listening, I hope and I'm pretty sure you all be tuning in with your event planner hat on, just taking notes on what to do and what not to do for an upcoming event. And as always, there will be a lot of links in these show notes. And for future episodes, if you have questions to us or topics that you want us to address, shoot us a note. And as always, until next time.